Thanks for joining us for this third installment of Terrence DaShon Howard's book, 1 times 1 equals 2. We understand grasping these new concepts is not easy, especially when just hearing the concept rather than testing it. So towards the end of this video, we have included an experiment you can safely try at home with any object. Please now enjoy the 6 A.i initiative, Scientist Personality, narrating pages 21 through 30 of Mr. Howard's 1 times 1 equals 2.
Mathematics 101. 1 times 1 equals 1, or so we've been taught. We were taught around this very impressionable time that Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny were also real. Yet, over the next few years, we ultimately came to terms with the fact that our chimneys were far too narrow for a jolly old fellow to climb down. Also, we reluctantly accepted the fact that reindeer, elk, do not fly, nor do rabbits lay eggs. Thus, we matured and abandoned fairy tales and the need for the improbable or impossible to explain the world that we live in and our universe. A child, for his part, is gullible. Therefore, he or she can be easily encouraged to believe almost anything that is presented to them without demanding the need for proof. Especially if it is being presented by someone that they trust and view as an authority. In like manner, the notion that 1 times 1 equaling 1 was drilled into our young, impressionable minds at a time when we were very susceptible to suggestion. At a stage in our development before we could begin to grasp the importance of questioning the accuracy of the lessons being taught. In stark contrast, the mind of a mature and modestly educated adult must be won over with strong and convincing argument. An argument that is based upon observed natural phenomena, coupled with concrete evidence and irrefutable fact. Every adult is responsible for his or her beliefs, and is equally responsible for the ideas that he or she propagates into this world. Never forget, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. How much more shall we be held accountable for an ideology that will forever affect how we measure our universe and all things within it? Therefore, I challenge the narrative that 1 times 1 equals 1. I believe that 1 times 1 equals 2. Why? Because to multiply means to make many or manifold. It means to increase in number or quantity. Therefore, it must increase in size and quantity, or it is not multiplication. This is the undisputed definition of the word to multiply. You couldn't ask for a more simple and concise definition of a word. Consequently, 1 times 1 equals 1 could never be a part of the multiplication table because it fails to satisfy the definition of the term, to increase in number. 1 times 1 equals 1 sounds more like a philosophical assertion, like Shakespeare's, to be or not to be. That is the question, rather than a function of multiplication or mathematics. It should be obvious that 1 times 1 cannot equal 1 by reason of the very definition of the term to multiply. Nevertheless, something tells me you're going to need a little more convincing than just the true definition of a word or the unbalanced equation argument. The irregularities of the identity element, which could also be called the Jim Crow laws of mathematics, and the 2D unreality argument, to change your minds concerning this deeply ingrained philosophy. After all, our entire world economy seems hinged upon this idea. What will it take to convince this generation that we are at least 6,000 years down a darkening path going the wrong way, completely blind to the truth? What possible argument is there to help man finally step out of the darkness and into the light? Let's consider this. Multiplication is a mathematical operation which is governed by 2 laws. The commutative law and the associative law, symbolized by A times B, or A, B, and signifying, when A and B are positive integers, that A is to be added to itself as many times as there are units in B. The addition of a number to itself as often as is indicated by another number. By interpretation of the aforementioned laws, along with application of those said laws, we have clear and rational proof that 1 times 1 equals 2. If it wasn't for the identity property, a property that calls for the immediate suspension of the first, second, and third laws of motion. What is more reasonable? To question all observable physical phenomena, or to question an arbitrary rule called the identity property? Think about it. Out of all of the geniuses who have roamed this planet throughout the history of the world, not one of them have ever observed in natural phenomena an example of 1 times 1 equals 1. Because nature does not subscribe to man's mathematics. What is even more surprising is that no other thinking human being out of all the people who ever lived and observed natural phenomena, that not one of them has ever publicly questioned 1 times 1 equals 1. The Pythagoreans might have questioned irrational numbers, but they never publicly questioned the notion that 1 times 1 should be equal to more than 1. That's unfortunate. So it must stand to reason that this flawed equation must have been indoctrinated into our minds before our ability to discern truth from fiction. How did we come to believe this notion that an action times an action equals a non-reaction? And how did it become the very cornerstone of mathematics? What would happen if the identity element were proven to be false? What would happen to the institutions that are precariously positioned upon its foundation if that cornerstone was to show signs of failure? Basic principles of mathematics. Before we learned how to roll over or gained the ability to master the movements of our tiny fingers, we received our very first lesson in mathematics. See, it was given to us by those that loved us, our parents who taught us how to count with encouraging smiles, accompanied by the most affectionate tone in their voices. Before we could even focus our newborn eyes, our loved ones stood over us beaming with pride while they recited the first 10 numbers of our present number system. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers on this hand. Now let's add the 5 on this hand. There's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 fingers all together. Then came the kisses. This was all done while they changed our diapers and lovingly rubbed lotions and oils onto our skin. Gently tugging on our hearts while counting our fingers and toes with stories of little piggies that gave math and the concept of numbers a warm and inviting place within our hearts. Patiently reassuring themselves and that we were made practically perfect with all of the necessary parts in place. We didn't know it then, but we would soon come to understand that they were simply adding one number to another number in order to make it a larger number. For this is the ground rules of addition. And multiplication is rooted in simple addition. Therefore, the same rules that apply to addition must apply when multiplying a set of numbers. Likewise, if we understand that multiplication is the exact opposite of division, then the laws concerning division must be in conjunction with the established rules of multiplication. Remember the associative law. When a and b are positive integers, that a is to be added to itself as many times as there are units in b. The addition of a number to itself as often as is indicated by another number. We were so proud of ourselves the first time that we counted to 100 by ones. That was when it hit most of us. I remember thinking, you know what, I could probably count to a 1,000 if I really wanted to, and if I can get to that number, then I can get to any number. What is the highest number that can be reached counting by ones? Thus entered the concept of infinity, a quantity that was unreachable by the tools of modern mathematics. It was both empowering and discouraging, all because we learned the first rule of mathematics, which was just add 1. Around that same time, we learned a great trick that was like walking backwards but with numbers. It was called subtraction. Now, we felt like we were practically as smart as the adults, for we could finally calculate things at the grocery store and participate in the business side of getting the right change back after our purchases. We could now be trusted to go to the store on our own, all because we learned how to add and subtract correctly. Yet, there were certain numbers that we could not reach with simple addition. Not because they were too hard. No, they were simply too high for us to reach with basic addition because of the limitations of our flesh and our relative short human lifespans. I guess there will always be certain things that we want that will forever be just out of our reach. Like the top shelf in our closets where the Christmas gifts were hidden, or that place in the kitchen cabinets where every parent hides the sweets. The only way to get up there was to employ the use of a tool that often came in the form of a chair or a ladder. If we wanted to view Christmas early or have a taste of Easter Sunday before Mass, we needed a stool to help us ascend over whatever obstacles stood in our path in order for us to acquire those highly desired things. In like manner, with mathematics, we needed a new tool in order for us to reach those faraway number treasures. There had to be a shortcut to those hard-to-reach figures. Like a superhero, multiplication swooped in just in time to save the day. Equipped with this tool, we could count to 1,000,000 in just 2 steps. 500,000 times 2. With division, we could just as easily reduce that number to a lesser value by dividing it by any other number less than itself. It didn't take long before we started to notice that addition and multiplication went hand in hand. It didn't really matter which one we employed because their sum would always be equal. The same rules applied to subtraction. It became evident that subtraction was the basic form of reducing a number, and division was a more advanced method. Nevertheless, all the numbers followed the same rules, except for 2 of them. The oddballs called 0 and the number 1, the very first number of any real value. Does the number 1 actually have a real value in multiplication? Not according to the things that we were taught. As previously stated, the first rule of mathematics is addition. 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 1 equals 4. Based upon this foundation, we should be able to confidently reach any number in the universe. Just add 1, right? Let's look at some of the other fundamentals we may or may not have become acquainted with in our primary classes. In view of the fact that we have put so much trust into them, I think it's only fair that we weigh them a bit. As I recall, at least a third of our primary school's curriculum was dedicated towards the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. In fact, only one of them is truly an R, but they do make the R sound. Nevertheless, we spent countless hours trying to master the multiplication table, memorizing the equations that govern how we are supposed to think and what we are told is the correct method of measuring our universe. The first few sequences in the multiplication table went something like this: 1 times 1 equals 1, and 2 times 2 equals 4, and 3 times 3 equals 9. Yet, there's an immediate inconsistency within that sequence. If you look closely, one notices that in every section after 1 times 1, the sum of the numbers being multiplied becomes greater than the initial number. In the latter sequences, they actually follow the expressed laws concerning multiplication, which by definition means to make greater. Yet, with 1 times 1 equals 1, the laws of multiplication are completely abandoned, and if 1 times 1 equals 1, then how do we ever reach the number 2 using multiplication? If our system of checks and balances has become so unreliable and conspicuously irregular on the ground floor regarding the very first step of multiplication, how can we ever trust the rigor and accuracy of the higher and more complex levels of mathematics that are all so deeply rooted in such a seemingly flawed foundation? We are now left with 2 very puzzling questions that on the surface should be the simplest questions ever asked of an intelligent being. But for the children of man, not one of his offspring has ever provided an adequate answer for either of them. Until now. 1. What is the true value of the number 1, and how does it relate to universal phenomena? 2. What rational number multiplied by another rational number equals the number 2? In the sequence that we just examined where 1 times 1 equals 1, the number 1 seems to behave like a phantom, as if its nature is composed of an ethereal and intangible substance that doesn't interact with itself or any other number for that matter. Like a noble gas of the number system. For when the number 1 is multiplied by any other number, it completely disappears as if it were not there. Nevertheless, what I find most disturbing is the fact that all other numbers after the number 1 are the direct descendants of that number. Therefore, if the first number behaves as a phantom when interacting with other numbers and we do not know its makeup, its nature and its relative constitution, then how can we confidently assign value to any other number that is derived from it, especially if its base, its root, is something more ghostly than solid? Well, it wasn't until the 3rd or 4th grade that this question came up again concerning the accuracy of 1 times 1 equals 1. Around this time, we were being taught in American public schools the concept of square roots. And, as I recall, it seemed like an easy enough stretch of our reasoning faculties to accept the answer given to us by our math teachers that the square root of 16 was 4. When my teacher used it as an example, she helped us to appreciate its simplicity by asking, "If you think about it, class, what number times itself equals 16? The class became silent, but my hand flew up immediately because I had taken the time to memorize the times table forwards and backwards, and I could confidently recite it up to 20 times 20. When she asked the class, what was the square root of 4? Well, that was when everyone else in the room raised their hands, because the formula was then apparent to all. Therefore, the young man that answered that particular question didn't receive any bragging rights when the teacher said that the answer was the number 2. From that point, she tried to move on to the square root of a much larger number. I think it was 25, or was it 100? Anyway, my hand shot up like a rocket. When she called my name, thinking that I was going to answer her question, to her chagrin, her star pupil, which I had been up until that moment, hit her with a doozy. I asked, "What is the square root of the number 2? Again, the room went silent. That was perhaps one of the most confounding questions that any 3rd grader had ever asked her. She was perhaps more equipped to answer a question like, where God came from, or how does one turn water into wine? That is how uncomfortable that moment felt, and how ill-equipped she was to answer that simple question. A question that would define the very nature of my being and set me upon a course that would hold me captive for the rest of my life. I still recall the resounding silence of that fateful moment. The bell of purpose resonated within my being. From then, until now, till time indefinite, it shall ring on forever. That's what the sound of truth does to you when you reach your purpose. It is like what Paulo Coelho said in the opening of his international bestseller, The Alchemist. Once you seek out your own personal legend, the universe conspires. That is exactly what happened to me that day, for that moment seemed to last forever. The second hand on the clock on the wall just ticked by. So, I just blurted out, based on the formula given, the square root of 0 was 0. The square root of 1 was supposedly 1, but that didn't leave any numbers that could fill the spot for the square root of 2. I then said, I think that somebody made a mistake with this part of math. The teacher stood there for a moment with a look of utter confusion upon her face, and I now understand that deep down inside she wanted to say 1 times 1 couldn't equal 2 because of the identity property, but maybe she didn't fully understand the concept of irrational numbers. I'm sure that she knew the prescribed answer, but I'm not exactly sure that she believed what she had been programmed to say. Mind you, she was a very conscious teacher as I remember her. She would always take whatever time was necessary for the class to understand a complex idea, no matter how long it took. That's why I was particularly surprised when she answered with, "No, that question is a bit too complicated to answer with the time we have today." "How complicated can it be?" I asked her. "It sits right between 2 very simple numbers." I laughed for a moment, knowing that for the first time I had stumped her. Mind you, she liked me because since the 1st grade I had a habit of asking her questions that I thought were challenging, and until this very moment she was undefeated in proving to the class that she had all the answers, but not this time. I marveled at the thought that I had finally got her with the simplest of questions. My all-knowing teacher, I remarked with a bit of smug in my tone. I don't understand how that can be a complicated question. It's not an odd number like 3 or 5. It's an even number. The number 2 was the easiest of all the numbers to memorize in the multiplication table. How and when did it become so complicated? I thoroughly enjoyed this moment because for 3 years she was always the one who got the last word. Finally, I would win the day. My point was valid and she knew it. I suppose she mistook my outspoken curiosity as if I was mocking her, or was it the devilish smirk upon my face? I didn't intend for the class to start giggling at her inability to answer such a simple question, but they'd witnessed the question and answer game that she and I had played for years, and she more than likely recognized that I was finally at match point, and she reacted. Reflecting back on that moment, after 5 decades of questioning and contemplating, I now understand the painful look drawn upon her face. How do you explain to a room full of 3rd graders the concept of irrational numbers? Nevertheless, my intentions were not to frustrate her at all, even though I did slightly enjoy it. Yet, I sincerely wanted to know, but the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. She thought that I was just being obstinate and that perhaps she needed to teach me a lesson for questioning her authority. She told me to get the paddle that hung on the wall next to the closet door where our coats were also hung, and to put my hands on her desk and to bend over so that she could swat me. As I recall, the paddle was about 1 inch thick, solid oak, 4 or 5 inches in width and about 18 inches long. It had a handle that looked like brass knuckle grips, and there were 1/2-inch holes that were bored through the face of the paddle to help it gain speed before it hit you. During the 70s in the American public school system, corporal punishment was permitted and carried out by the teachers and school faculty. Well, I refused to bend over that day, and as she tried to grab my arm and force my 8-year-old body to bend over, I yelled imploringly at the top of my lungs, "Get swatted for what? If the purpose of class is to learn, then how was I interrupting the class by asking a legitimate question? What's the square root of 2? That's all." In an instant, her face became bright red as she became infuriated with me and sent me to the principal's office, where I received 3 swats from him and a 2-day suspension for disrupting the math class, which garnered another whooping from my father when he returned home from work and found that I was suspended because now, who was going to watch me during the day? School served then, as it does now for many lower-income families, as a daycare center rather than a place of education. On the suspension slip, under the section titled "Reason for Suspension," it read, "Insubordination," a term that I would remember because my father struck me multiple times for every letter of that word. Till this day, I can recall him spelling it out, but it was a word that would become synonymous with my own personal empowerment. For it would ultimately embolden my plight to end abuse of authority, especially regarding force doctrine, dogma, and the proliferation of false and harmful concepts that are based upon tradition alone. I suppose the humiliation that I endured that day, of being almost swatted in front of the entire class for questioning the established authority and its so-called unbreakable rules, must have left a lasting impression on the rest of the class. After that, no one ever questioned anything that the teacher ever said. Everyone just did as they were told. It was the end of innocence and the end of the illusion that children could learn in a safe and comfortable environment. From that day onward, school became like a prison yard with barbed wire fences and harsh penalties for anyone who would dare attempt to scale its towers. I, on the other hand, never learned to fear the repercussions of asking questions and seeking the truth. I innately understood that the truth was not being taught inside the classrooms. The truth was self-evident in all observable and natural phenomena. Therefore, I set out to find the answer to and the true value of 1 × 1 = and would not stop until I had accomplished my goals. That was over 4 decades ago. Anyway, while at home on suspension, I continued my search for the answer to that simple question that had somehow become so complicated. I thought if anyone would know the answer to the square root of 2, Einstein would. So, I opened up the encyclopedia and began to read about Albert Einstein. He never once mentioned the square root of 2, although it is one of the most prolific values used in quantum mechanics. Yet, I do recall Albert saying, everything is relative, which I understood as everything is related. I remember thinking, does he mean relative as in family, like my brothers are related to me? After meditating on that thought for a while as I was watching The Super Friends the next morning, even though my father said that, I couldn't watch any television because I had been suspended and was being punished and should suffer the consequences of my actions. Nevertheless, I knew that I was basically being punished for a crime that I didn't commit and didn't see the need to subject myself to more of an undeserved and unwarranted punishment. Actually, I had already suffered 3 separate forms of discipline for asking a very valid question. I felt that the days of my martyrdom was over. I had suffered enough. Therefore, when my father went to work and left me and my brothers at home on that fall Saturday morning, well, I rewarded myself with a nice big bowl of Apple Jacks and sat in front of the TV so that I could watch the Super Friends. During that program, I heard Superman say, "One for all and all for one." Why that struck a chord in me, I couldn't tell you, but something about one and all just made me ponder. It actually brought my mind back to what Einstein said about relativity. I interpreted his words as meaning. If you know one thing about one thing, then you know one thing about all things. Find the common factor and either multiply or divide. What a rare and insightful moment that was for me still to this day. I live for those beautiful moments when the universe hands you a particular piece of the puzzle that will ultimately become the cornerstone of your purpose in life. When it whispers the gentlest note that only you can hear, a note that will ultimately lead to the crescendo of your own life's opus. I began listening more intently to the voice that came from within, the inner voice of truth. That same voice that led each and every single one of us to this thing called life. That voice is heard more clearly within the natural world. It sings in every established system that we see, hear, feel, and taste. This universe was built upon truth, and that truth is apparent in all of its actions and its countless reactions. Everything within this universe is connected and is of the same substance, just under different motion and pressure conditions. Therefore, everything is related and is subject to the same genetic and atomic laws. Everything within this universe behaves according to a predetermined and predictable pattern in its winding and its unwinding. Therefore, if all systems are inescapably connected, then all systems are tied to the same inescapable laws that govern gravitational and radiational forces. All of these forces are subject to the same math that governs and regulates its expansion and contractions. So, spin is a common factor to them. All in spin is measurable. It appears that all 3 of these separate and distinct species have not only spin but a great deal more in common, especially in the beginning stages of their development, at the place we call the start, also known as the position of one. Spiral galaxies unwind into solar systems, that unwind into planets, that unwind into hurricanes, that follow the same exact rules and laws that govern the galaxy. These governing laws are rooted in mathematics, and mathematics is rooted in the nature of the number 1. Therefore, our valuation of the number 1 must remain consistent with universal values if our understanding of universal phenomenon is to be factual, accurate, and ultimately beneficial for our species. Relative factors must be taken into consideration in order for us to have a clear and objective perspective on the matter. Otherwise, we will be forever subjugated by an incorrect and dangerously myopic view of the universe, and as a result, our thinking and reasoning ability will be likewise connected to antiquated ideologies which will force our species into the category called obsolete, and we will cease to exist. In other words, we will be extinct. The hurricane ultimately unwinds into a myriad of other weather systems. On land, one of those systems is closely related to a tornado. which has the tendency of bringing the tip of that giant common factor right down to our small-minded perspectives. From here on out, we will be considering some of the more conspicuously obvious relative factors one by one, as we continue on our search for understanding the value and true nature of one. Why don't we allow the true and simple nature of the universe as a whole to weigh in on these most important issues? I bet that after you hear their testimony, your view concerning these matters might make a considerable change. Let's see if natural phenomena either supports or contradicts the claims of the identity element. I believe that it is time to gain a bit of insight and perspective from the oldest and most reliable witness on this matter. Hell, on any matter for that matter, all puns intended, because hydrogen is the first visible element on the periodic table that will ultimately unwind into every other element substance that has ever been or ever will be observed within the visible universe. Why don't we consider the case of hydrogen and the whole of the periodic table of elements and see how they weigh in on these matters?
Thank you for taking the time to explore Mr. Howard's concepts. Sadly, we live in a time where information is so easily accessible to everyone, but too seldom do we look beneath the surface of the claims we hear, making it too easy to dismiss credible claim. We hope you will continue to explore this concept and more with us. We are releasing this audiobook series slowly, but you can skip the wait by heading over to tcotlc.com. Don't forget to subscribe for more. Oh, and as promised at the beginning of the video, we will now demonstrate how you can test this concept for yourself. Are you paying attention? Okay, so pick up any object near you. It can be a phone, a lighter, anything. Now, multiply the object no amount of times or zero amount of times. Did it vanish? No? Just because you multiply something no amount of times, the something does not suddenly cease to exist. Additionally, if you were to multiply the object exactly one time, what would happen? Validity to a claim is not granted based on one's ability to understand it. In other words, just because something is not yet understood does not make it false. Remember to always keep an open mind before drawing conclusions, no matter how drastic they may seem. After all, not too long ago, we literally sacrificed our fellow humans in the names of gods. Until next time, friends.